Inner Voice, a heartfelt chat with Dr. Foojan.
Break free from the forces holding you back. Get the life you deserve. Eliminate stress, reduce anxiety, decrease depression, and start living your full potential. Thousands have used Dr. Foojan Zeine's awareness integration theory, an evidence-based behavioral health breakthrough with incredible life-changing results. Getting rid of past trauma, having fulfilling relationships, increasing earnings, and living their best life. Now, the Foojan app is available to everyone. The app is Dr. Foojan Zeine's awareness integration theory in the palm of your hand. Download the Foojan app today.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Inner Voice podcast, a heartfelt chat with me, Dr. Foojan Zeine. I'm a psychotherapist and author, the originator of the awareness integration theory and the Foojan app, where you can get the awareness integration theory in every area of your life at the time that you could just do it at ease whenever you want to. And many of you have asked about the books in awareness integration theory. Go to awarenessintegration.com and look at the books. There's Life Reset, which is for you who love to do self-help books and do your own journaling. You can get awareness integration therapy for all your wonderful counselors, mental health workers, psychotherapists, life coaches who want to do this method with your clientele. You can also be certified in this method, and your name will be put in as a provider in the awarenessintegration.com and Foojan app. And we also have the book Intentional Parenting, which is for all of you wonderful parents, teachers, grandparents, whomever is raising kids. And you can get that book and look at every chapter relating to the age of your child and know how, through the awareness integration theory, work and raise your child in the best of their capacity and capability. It's so nice to be with all of you today. And today in this episode, I'm so excited to chat with Silvia Dutchevici. She is a licensed clinical social worker. She's the president and the founder of Critical Therapy Institute. As a trained psychotherapist, she created critical therapy on perceiving a need for the theory and practice of psychology to reflect how race, class, gender, and religion interests with psychological conflicts appear in therapy. She's a founding board member of Black Women's Blueprint and a member of the Physicians for Human Rights Asylum Network, where she conducts psychological evaluations documenting evidence of torture and persecution for survivors fleeing danger in the home countries. She trained at Bellevue, NYU, Survivors of Torture Program, the Parent-Child Center of New York, Psychoanalytic Society, and New York Freudian Society. She has a master's degree in social work from New York University and a master's degree in psychology from the New School and a master's degree in religious studies and political science from Fordham University. She's lectured and presented throughout the country on critical therapy, including Fordham and New York University, NYU, and has been featured in Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, Psychology Today, The Guardian, International Business Times, and Women's Health. So we talked about her book, Critical Therapy, and how the relationship that you have within the psychotherapy can really support you in all around of who you are, addressing some of the societal, political policies that affect every single one of us, and how the relationship that you create can really not only heal you, but take that healing and bridge it into all other areas of your life. So I had a great conversation with her, and I hope that you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. Now subscribe to this podcast, my YouTube channel, and connect with me through my website, foojanzeine.com, or go to the app, Foojan app. You can also go to foojan.com or any of the social medias. Share with me your thoughts. I love to hear from you because what you say to me, who you want to hear from, all the conversations and topics that you want to hear about will be here. if you share with me what you want. So now, without further ado, here's Silvia Dutchevici. Well, welcome to the show, Silvia. Everyone, Silvia Dutchevici. As I shared with you, she is the founder of Clinical Therapy Institute, which I am so excited to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I got your book, Clinical Therapy, Critical
Therapy. Mm-hmm.
It was interesting to me where I saw, I've been a therapist for 30 years, and I've kind of gone to, behavioral therapies and cognitive therapies, emotional therapies. I created my own institute and a therapy model, the awareness integration therapy. But one of the things that I really, really enjoyed as I was reading about critical therapy had to do with kind of bringing an angle of what we truly live into the world as a human being who relates to the world, and the world relates to us. So it's not, sometimes psychotherapy is dealt with, which is like, it's only the balloon inside that thinking, feeling, and all of that, which it's not accurate. It is a constant relatedness with the world and the way it is. And then you brought these beautiful constructs of how we deal with power, not only from a family construct, but also from a society construct. So it was really beautiful to read and see and look at. Share with us, how come that angle for you?
Well, thanks for reading the book. I'm always pleased to hear that people have read it, liked it. I always look for constructive criticism as well. I've learned that we grow as long as we ask questions and we don't get too set in our ways. So yeah, it's a complicated question. I mean, I don't know, how much is it a personal narrative as well as a political one? Because the personal is always political, how I've come to critical therapy. I do know that I had trained in psychoanalytic theory. That was my home. And I always found that it was missing something. And especially then going to social work school and being interested in social justice and how systemic oppression influences and interacts with mental health issues was really fascinating. And yet we only talk about it on the level of theory. We talk about it either, I almost feel like there's two schools of thought or two really divergent paths. There is the clinical path, which is often about your intrapsychic problems, why your mom hit you and what did that mean for you and how you show up in the world. And there is the systemic social work analysis of how systems can be oppressive or liberatory. And yet, within the psychotherapy hour, those two schools of thought or paths never actually meet. And I think that it is important as a therapist to be aware that there is systemic problems that influence one's mental health. And there's also the importance of analyzing intrapsychic problems. So you have to connect the two. Now, why I say it's also a personal journey is because, I am an immigrant. I came from Romania. My parents came here as we escaped one of the most brutal dictatorships in Eastern Europe. And it's not surprising that at some point I wanted to be a therapist and work with torture survivors. I wanted to work with people who escaped political persecution. And the more I got into that work, the more I realized that post-traumatic stress disorder and PTSD actually happens to women, mostly in their homes. And it's something that we don't talk about. We don't talk about domestic violence. We don't talk about childhood sexual abuse. So I actually shifted my sort of studies and the population I worked with women who escaped, and not just women, but men, but mostly, unfortunately, still women who've escaped these horror stories. And that's how I realized that access to, money, your race, your gender, and all these things influence and interact with your mental health. And I wanted to bring that into the psychotherapeutic hour. And you have to analyze power, right? You cannot deal with mental health issues without looking at political issues, and you cannot look at political issues without looking at power dynamics. And what I mean by power is our ability to change the world and the systems within the world that give us that ability or curtail that ability.
There's so much there to unpack on what you said. I'm an immigrant. Obviously, I come from Iran. I moved when I was 12 alone. So I was, and we have the women's movement right now going in Iran. So I also, like you said, worked a lot with refugees that went from Afghanistan or Iran to Turkey and Greece, and worked with them in the camp. And as they immigrate to California, I've worked a lot with them. And you are so right on and accurate about the experience of sometimes the learned helplessness that women and men in different societies are raised with, and they survive. So most of psychotherapy has been in how to survive and how to gain within the system versus, how do you have the power to shift the system? And I think that takes, well, first you got to figure out how to gain yourself within a system before you could take the shift. But there was another awesome thing you just said, which is if we are not aware of the systematic oppression that is. I remember I was in India with a group of African Americans where, one woman was sharing with us about the systemic oppression that was there, and I had no idea. And she started sharing with me so many books and videos, and I started educating myself to know what it is, because people can stereotype, people can share and talk about a culture in a particular way, but if there's no understanding of how trauma and messages move intergenerationally to the next level, and we're sometimes shocked about why is a group of people have more of a symptomology or an illness or a certain behavior. And, we start looking at that, and then how to support that group of not only supporting themselves and rising above to be living their best, but also when you attach it and link it to the bigger picture, the person also sees themselves within a society and not so isolated.
Yes, and the truth is ideology or values, they're already present in the clinical hour. There's this myth that we've been taught as therapists to believe that somehow if we don't invite the political, or if we don't bring the issues that interact with our systemic world, somehow they're non-existent, but they're already present. The fact that we don't talk about it means, as therapists, more often than not, is that we align ourselves with the status quo. And then our patients somehow, consciously or unconsciously, know not to talk about those things, know how not to bring certain parts of their identities into the therapy. And then it's a missed opportunity to analyze things, but ultimately it's a missed opportunity for healing. You can't, for example, be a woman and not talk about sexism or misogyny in therapy because it's already there. You can be a person of color and not address racism. But what I would go a step further and say is that it is also imperative, for a person, for me, for example, right? I'm this white lady. If I have a patient who happens to be white that's sitting across from me, racism is already present anyway. Just because it doesn't impact us the same way and we have certain privileges, it doesn't mean we shouldn't address those privileges, because it's important to analyze how those privileges have made us who we are today, how they've contributed either positively or negatively on who we are in the world and how we show up in the world.
And you share in your book that the therapeutic relationship and the alliance that is there is some sort of a representative of all the relationships that gets created. So how do you bring that relationship that is here within the session with two people and relate that to others? Is it more like you watch what's not working and then relate it and then give skills and then share this with the other areas of life?
So yes, and the relationship is essential, I believe, to healing, because most of our neuroses happened with other people. Most of our wounds happen in connection with others because we're human beings. And it is through a relationship that one gets to heal. What we've done in critical therapy is that the relationship develops over time. It also looks very different over time. In the first stage of critical therapy, and sometimes the stages are not linear, but more often than not, they are. So in the first stage of critical therapy, we start off very sort of psychoanalytically or psychodynamically, where we are the person that reveals very little about ourselves, and our patients sort of see us as an authority figure. Why we do this is because we discover that the transference gets to be activated much quicker this way. I also think it says something about the world we live in. It says something about parenting. It is no wonder that our patients and all of us respond to this type of being in the world, because our first authority, quote unquote, figures, which are our parents, more often than not exert power over us, right? We're not very collaborative with kids. We still have a long way to go on that. So in the first stage of critical therapy, there is a power over, right? And at that point, the person who comes to therapy sees us or sees me as the therapist who has all the answers and so forth. Now, and that enables me to look at their relationship dynamics, how they show up in other relationships, because they know very little about me, how they interact, intrapsychically, but also interpersonally, right? How do they respond to certain things? And then as the relationship sort of develops and we move on, we move to a second stage, which is, think about the feminist movement in the 70s of critical consciousness, of really analyzing our relationship with each other, of analyzing power dynamics within the therapeutic hour, but also outside the therapeutic hour. This is a very important step because, as we know, especially for people who have been oppressed and marginalized, power is something that one usurps, something that one has to claim. No one empowers anyone. That's very paternalistic, right? It's sort of like, how do I wrestle with power? How do I reckon? How do I get to discuss this? And then as we do that work, we move towards the last stance of critical therapy, which is a more collaborative stance. And it's think about Paulo Freire, who was an educator in Latin America, who talked about two people meeting to dialogue about the world. And that's where we learn about how people can share space together. How do we negotiate? Most of us don't have very good example of negotiations in relationship. And it feels like our culture is more and more interested in being right rather than being collaborative and rather than having a consensus. So I feel that if you can do it in therapy, if you could have these difficult conversations, if you could reckon with very important and complicated issues with one person, and if you could trust one person, then you have that blueprint to do it with other people in your life.
This was very much the experience I had, let's say 4 years ago when Trump was a president, and you had every single household getting at each other's throat because of these conversations. Friendships were breaking up, family members were breaking up. And I remember the conversations in the therapy room was intense.
Mm-hmm.
Would show up and exactly what you said, and knowing how to be with another person's ideology it becomes so important. And then again, obviously, I see a lot of, immigrants and Iranians where, because of the new movement, there's again a hype, people get angry at each other and start fighting with each other out there. And this concept of having the ability to be with a controversial conversation, which it also is impacting you. So it's not like, oh, we're just going to talk about theory about another space. No, it actually is a controversial conversation that is happening here now and among people who are within your community. And as I hear you, you're saying if in a safe space, that conversation not only is shared, but the skills of negotiative listening and communicating is practiced, then that same skill can be bridged into other realms of life.
Yes. And I think that starts with a personal relationship from the people that you love, from your children, from your parents, and so forth. And it morphs and moves out towards, your friends, your politicians, and so forth. We are no longer a society. I don't know if we ever been, but for sure, we're not a society that could tolerate discomfort, but also that could tolerate opinions that are different than ours. And what I often say is that it is important to be able to discuss things so we could all learn from each other. I don't think we know how to do it. I don't think any government, I don't think any side of the aisle knows what's the right way, and we're all happy. So capitalism has failed most of us. No other system seems to be working that great anyway. So why don't we try to invent something new rather than always go back to old ideas and old way of being in the world that have left so many people behind?
You say personal is political. Share why. To me and to many people, these are so different, although every single human being is impacted by the politics and policies that they live in and across the world. But where is it that there's a line between someone who, so there's a difference between every human being is political versus there's political activism, there's political information and kind of like education, let's say, if I'm educating myself across it, or is it just someone who's living their life and getting impacted by it, but not necessarily have educated themselves about it, nor that it feels that it has any impact on it. Now, in some countries where you actually do get to vote and your vote matters, obviously education around it and activism around it and all of that makes a lot more sense. In countries that you really have no point, or there's no way that you can be directly. Definitely you could do things non-directly, but directly you don't have access to that. Then are you only a receiver of it, or are you also in any factor an influencer on it?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. It brings up something that I struggle with whenever I talk about, when I say we invite the political, because I don't know if political is the right word, and I still struggle with what is the right word. Because the word, and I want to say maybe it's human rights, but it's not quite that. Or policies, what we mean by that. In very clear examples, here in the United States, our access to childcare, our access to medical insurance, our access to a living wage impacts in a very real and tangible way our mental health. For example, I have patients who, because of the precarity of their work, if they work in certain jobs, they don't actually get their weekly schedule till at the end of the week. So it's difficult to schedule a psychotherapy session, because we can't have it every Monday at 5, for example, because you don't know your schedule. But it's difficult to schedule anything in your life. If we stopped for a second and thought, what can that do to your mental health? What can that do to your sense of agency in the world? And yet, we don't ever say it that way because people often say, I don't want to talk about politics, or I don't want to talk about these things. How does it impact me? So maybe it's not politics as in the big P, but politics as in the small policies that we created, the ideology that we sort of cling to. One of the things I've realized in doing this work more and more is that sometimes the values that we think we hold in our heads, we don't actually hold in our hearts. And this is why sometimes what we say we want or how we want to show up in the world doesn't match how we show up in the world. And what a simple example of that is, I have a patient who, sort of, she is a new mom. She wanted to stay home with her child. She said she's a feminist. She's like, this is going to be one of the most important jobs I'll be doing. I want to do this. She has a child. 2 months in, we sit down, we talk about her sense of worthlessness. I'm not producing anything. Because although the ideology in her head intellectually is like, no, motherhood is really important. It's a choice I have. I'm creating the new generation of people and so forth. In our hearts, we've learned that it's not really valued work. You should be producing something. You should create something. You should be sort of, the man who, goes out there and makes, millions of dollars. So this is why this work, I think, is important to do in psychotherapy, because it's not just this out there, it's always within us. And the way we live our lives sometimes are against our interests because we are so married, quote unquote, to these ideologies or these values that don't actually represent our interests.
So what I hear from you when you're using the political term is more how the societal structures that are created, whether due to public policies or corporate policies or political standing, it impacts us in so many different layers. And if we are not necessarily aware of the impact, then not only that we don't know how to deal with it, sometimes we take it very personal, as if there's something wrong with us. And knowing where the duality of what's inside, what the need is inside, versus the messages and the structures that the external world puts us, and then we look at it as something wrong with me, versus no, I'm okay, and it's natural for me to have these emotions and thoughts and struggles with a system that doesn't necessarily work for me. Now, maybe the system works for others, and maybe it's kind of a system that needs to handle all different preferences, might be hard to come by. Because I remember when you were talking about, there was a lot of research that came about that the brain of a teenager needs so much sleep, and usually they're more nocturnal. So this concept of waking them up at 6 o'clock in the morning and having them, be at their first educational hour at 8 o'clock in the morning just doesn't work, and that's why so many teenagers are falling off from going to high school, or they're having so many disasters because they're not having enough sleep because they're nocturnal. On this side, they want to stay up until 12 because their brain changes at that time. That's just a biological factor. However, with all of this knowledge, the concept of changing the school system that also related to a work system where their parents had to put them at a school where they had to go to work and be at work between 8 and 9, well, it was going to create a huge chaos in the whole system. So it's like, too bad, too much, forget it. We're just not going to change anything. And then that's where you can see where the need, a biological need, an emotional need, a phase of life need is probably going to, kind of clash with a whole society system that is moving along in a certain way. And the knowledge of where do I begin and end, and where the messages and the society's rituals and structures lead, and how do I kind of interact with that, in a sense, is what I'm hearing, that it's a part of a conversation in therapy.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent example of how we know it's never about just research, because people say, well, if we had more data, we would do the right thing. No, it's not just about data, because it's not up here, it's in here. And we have all made a commitment to capitalism. Unfortunately, that's what it's about. Because sure, if teenagers had to start school at 12, then parents would have to work less or work different hours. And we don't want to rock that system, not because it works, but because, again, it would require for us to think outside the box. But usually what happens is people just go, well, what do you want? Socialism? Is that the answer? I don't know, maybe, maybe not, but that is not the only answer. That's only a possibility. I will also clarify, just in simple terms, I think it's both. It's both the intrapsychic and the political. For example, you have a patient who comes in, lost their jobs. I do think good therapy, part of good therapy, is to analyze, well, you know, Susie, you seem to be losing a lot of jobs. What is happening? You seem to always get into conflict with people. This reminds me of how you got into conflict with your brother or so forth. That's therapy 101. That is necessary, and that should not ever go away. However, what critical therapy does differently, and what I argue most therapists need to add on to, is the second part of the conversation after we do all that good work. What does it say that we live in a country where the precarity of work is that you are so disposable, that you could get fired at any moment, that you have no job security, that now you struggle with how you're going to pay your bills? Because that also impacts your mental health. It also impacts how you show up at the next job and so forth. So you could see it's not either or, which I think it's a false dichotomy, rather than it's always intertwined.
Well, it's a movement that you could see as the people see that the system doesn't take care of them. Now they have no loyalty to the system, and therefore a whole movement changes about, well, I don't care. I'm just going to do whatever I want to do. And now we're facing that people can't find good employees, or people's employees aren't staying, or they're calling right after the COVID. They're calling the shots and saying, no, I don't think so. If you don't pay me such and such, I'm not coming. So it's very interesting where for decades I used to hear in therapy and with people about, oh my God, I'm such a great employee, they don't see my value. And the conversation is switched into, a complaint from employers that we cannot even get employees. They won't even show up because of what we're offering. They won't even take. So it's interesting how the society kind of there's a movement into surviving something. You're gonna take care of yourself, and people will start taking care of themselves from another angle. So you can see this thing kind of starts tilting from one extreme to the other, yes, as the human, progresses.
Yes, and I also think that, when we talk about work, our work conditions have not improved. I do see why some workers will push back, because, there used to be that joke where you used to work for a company and, 40 years later, you got your watch and you're retired. That is no longer the status quo. People don't have the security of their job. So I could understand why you might push back. You might say, you want me to do this for this little amount of money with no security, sometimes no, medical insurance, no benefits. No, it's not worth it.
Mm-hmm. You've talked about equity in your book. One of the chapters is how do we go about looking at equity and present it within a relationship, then for it to move across other relationships. Can you share a bit about that?
Sure. So equity, it's interesting, that chapter, which is the chapter we have about our sliding scale, our radical sliding scale, is we talk about, we wanted to make sure that everyone from all walks of life has access to good quality psychotherapy services, right? So, and we also wanted, the second part of that, we also wanted to make sure that as therapists, we could make a comfortable living, right? Because there are a lot of people who dedicate their lives. I was one of them who worked in social service agencies with very low money, and I was always overworked and burned out, and that's not sustainable. And then, of course, I was told, well, what's the option? You're going to, quote unquote, sell out and just do private practice and see rich people. That's a false dichotomy. So I was like, there's got to be something else. I got to do something different. And I did, which what we've created is that at critical therapy, everyone who comes into our, sort of space and comes for therapy pays according to their income and resources. So that psychotherapy hour costs, let's say $1 or $1,000. And that, again, that sounds lovely, right? For most of us, like, well, yeah, that's fair. And yet, when you sit across the couch and you hear $1,000 for that session, you struggle with it. And you struggle with it for two reasons. First of all, you struggle with it because although the scale is equitable, meaning everyone pays the same percentage for that psychotherapy hour, the same percentage of their income and resources, it doesn't feel right. And you also struggle because I think deep down, we still have this bias against psychotherapy and mental health. We don't value mental health the same way we value physical health. I think most of us, and I challenge all of you who are listening, I challenge, even you, when you sit there and you're like, how much should a session cost? There is a cap. We all have a cap. We don't want to say what it is. For some of us, it's like $200. For some of us, it's $500. But there is a moment where even though it might be equitable, we struggle. And I'll give you an example. I saw this woman for therapy and she was paying, let's say $100. And then she got a promotion at work and made double what she was making. So now obviously you're paying $200 for the session. And we sat across each other and she said, Silvia, I know that it's right. I know that it's fair. It just doesn't feel right. Although, if you think about it, it was the same percentage of her income and resources. Nothing changed in our payment, except that somewhere deep down, it felt unfair.
Yes.
And I think that you take that, not just with money, with everything. Talk about racism, sexism. Equity means that we have to be aware that having some privileges means that we need to show up more responsibly. We need to speak up. We need to do things differently. And that's hard.
I also think that what the example you're bringing also has to do with the cultural structure that is put in. So, for example, if you look at the same conversation when it comes into religious giving percentage, like, you need to pay a percentage, 10% of your earning to your church, for example, synagogue, mosque, wherever. From a perspective of that, there is no conversation about fairness there because it doesn't have a cap.
Right.
So if you're saying, for example, you have to pay this much money because of your taxes to the government, it's already created a structure as if, well, this much of your dollar amount or earning has to go for tax, and this is what your taxes are for. Or even on entrepreneurship. So some person says, I don't want to pay the tax to the government, but I prefer to pay this percentage of my money to a nonprofit organization or an NGO, which is tax deductible, but at least it's still the percentage. So in those conversations where there isn't a cap and the world only goes by percentage, it seems like that is a structure that is acceptable. But I do get that when you're working on mental health, even health, you're working with insurance systems, you're working with other structures, that you're absolutely right that the cap is part of the structure. So you can come down from the cap, but it's very hard to go up from the cap because the whole system is put on from that structure. Before we leave, there's another important factor in your book, which is love, in how we feel it, experience it, bring it, generate it, express it.
Yeah. How we talk about love. We're a society, I feel, that we lack conversations of genuine love. We've known how to commercialize love. We know how to talk about romantic love. It's always transactional. You give me this, I give you that. But we no longer have conversations about love and friendship, love and personal regards. I say this often. I think one of the deepest things that I've learned as a therapist, I think it ultimately taught me how to love, is that I've learned how to love a person without being invested in their outcome. Where to be with someone and be a witness to their life to be with someone and have a positive regard and really attempt to understand them. That's genuine love, rather than if you do this, then I will love you. Or if you achieve this, then you're great. And I would love to have more conversations about love and to really sort of, instead of leaning into hate, right? Because we do that, or competition, or let's lean into collaboration. Let's lean into loving each other, which could be achieved. And yet we don't do that. And I don't think we really, if you think about children, we don't really teach our children how to do that. We teach them how to be competitive. We teach them how to be the best. We don't give them little stickers for, you were the most collaborative in school today. That is great. Wow, you gave, your friend a hug because they asked you for one. How lovely. Here you go, Susie. We don't do that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, everyone, critical therapy, power and liberation in psychotherapy. So, is there anything we haven't shared that you really want people to know?
What I would like for people to know is that, I would like for them to challenge their therapists if they're going to therapy, because I think most therapists are good people, right? We all do this because we want to help people. I sometimes, or more often than not, feel that our schools or our institutes have not given us the tools to actually engage with people in a way that's transformational. So I would like for therapists out there to really sort of try to get the skill and to ask themselves, what am I doing in this clinical hour? Am I accommodating my patient to an oppressive system, or am I actually fighting for human liberation? And I would like for people who go to therapy to really sort of engage in uncomfortable conversations with their therapists, and to bring their many different identities into that clinical space, because it should be a space where you get to talk about everything, not just some things.
Absolutely. Everyone, Silvia Dutchevici, critical therapy, and go to Critical Therapy Institute and find more information about her work, about her book, and her institute. Thank you so much, Silvia, for being with us.
Thank you. I really loved your questions. Thanks for engaging in conversation with me.
Of course. And thank you for being with us, and everyone who's out there. Create an amazing life for yourself and everyone around you. And until next week, bye-bye.
Eliminate stress, reduce anxiety, and decrease depression. Dr. Foojan Zeine's awareness integration theory has helped thousands like you get incredible life-changing results. The Foojan app gives you her evidence-based treatment in the palm of your hand. Download today.